Hello again, everyone. I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Sepas. I'd like to welcome today's experts. We have back on stage with us Jeff Zatino. He is the Research and Policy Director at All in Education. Also back with us, Dr. Marla Franco, Vice President, HSI Initiatives at the University of Arizona. And joining us too is Dr. Cecilia Maez, Superintendent, Alhambra Elementary School District. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started on today's panel, a little bit about All in Education. All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build in Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Through Sepas, All in Education has been working to bridge their advocacy efforts to be inclusive of multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Now, the focus of Sepas is on having real, thought-provoking conversations with leaders and community members and identifying solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. This season will exclusively focus on the issue of poverty, the social determinant of education. Through that, an analysis All in Education found was the leading factor that had the greatest negative impact on the welfare of families, communities, students, and schools. So each episode this season will dive deeper into this multi-layered issue and how through cross-sector collaboration, we can come up with innovative solutions. So let's get into that conversation, and Jeff, we'll start with you. Talking about low-income communities, and low-income communities, we continue to see like the gap widen, right? And so what's happening? What are the consequences when we continue to see these low-income communities underserved when we're talking about general student outcomes?
Yeah, so actually in our first report, we published a graph that showed the widening gap of income, right? And we've all seen the statistics that higher earners are accumulating a lot of the wealth that's coming out of our economy. So this has detrimental effects to our communities, families, and students. For the first part, we know that children experiencing poverty usually lag behind their more affluent peers. And we see this in the outcomes in literacy, math skills, and even high school graduation and access to post-secondary education. So this starts to impact that family, that child, and even the surrounding school system, because we're also seeing that schools in low-income communities have a harder time with resources and have access to limited resources, which means that they can't hire or retain high quality teachers. They don't have the technology that's necessary for today's education, and they lack proper educational and learning materials within the classroom setting. And it also starts to spill out into the community, right? So we're seeing that low-income communities suffer from higher rates of crime, higher rates of violence, lack of access to education and employment, and it starts ultimately to segregate low-income communities into the pockets of our communities that we see that are higher in Hispanic, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we're seeing segregation and lack of access to opportunity.
Dr. Miles, let's get your perspective on this, what you see when we're talking about how challenging it can be just for any student to come to school and sometimes be successful with the curriculum, but how poverty plays a role, and then what you're seeing when it comes to student outcomes.
You know, I'm thinking about everything you just said, Jeff, and it reminds me of two young men, a fifth grader and a sixth grader, brothers that I'm getting to know right now in our school, one of our schools. And the boys have been sharing with me that their mother, they go to bed every night thinking about how they watch their mother and the stress that she has because she's struggling right now knowing she's facing eviction. And as much as they wish that there was something they could do, they bear that stress, especially knowing that there isn't anything they can do. And so when I think about the overall experience of children that are experiencing poverty like this, the fact is they have many distractions. And that's what I would say what poverty, some of the barriers that poverty is creating for them. I'm also reminded of another young lady who I just spoke to in one of our schools who was speaking about the stress of having her father recently deported and how he was the provider for the family. And watching mom struggle through that and trying to figure out how she is not only going to keep a roof over their head, but how she's going to even just provide meals. And so this young lady sits in our classrooms every day wanting to learn, capable of learning, but very distracted by all the consequences of, again, the poverty that they're living in.
Yeah, hard to focus on a math test when that's happening in your life. Dr. Franco, let's talk about sometimes at the college level, those issues can be overlooked. Like, oh, they're college students, they're fine. These issues don't affect them. But can you explain from your perspective what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the very stressors that you just described, right, don't dissipate, as students make their way to colleges and universities, right? Those set of circumstances and societal factors stay connected and influence the experience of these students, their families, and the community. So once students arrive to our colleges and universities, and in particular at the University of Arizona, we actually administer a survey to incoming college students. And actually this fall of this current academic year, 40% of the incoming class identified that they would need some or a lot of mental health support. So already at the front end of their college journey, they're already telling us that this is a need and this will likely be an issue and a barrier to their academic success if we don't connect them to the right resources.
And Jeff, we talked about in the open where poverty is a multi-layered issue here, and let's talk about generational poverty here and overcoming that and how that plays a role in education.
Yeah, and this is closely linked to that first question, right? So we see an increase in income gap, but we're also seeing it translate to the future generation. And the way that that's playing out is that we're seeing families really struggle with providing resources to their children, right? So if you're living in poverty, you have lack of access to resources like healthcare, employment, or even basic necessities like food and shelter. And like you were saying, Dr. Mayas, is that our children are bearing that, that the burden of poverty or like that stress that comes with it. So we're seeing higher levels of chronic disease because you don't have access to healthcare. We're seeing higher levels of mental health because you don't have that support system within your house or within your community. And what you start to see is this cycle of poverty, right? Where lack or limited resources bleeds into poor outcomes, and poor outcomes leads into lack of opportunity, and then the lack of opportunity leads to this entrenched set or sense of poverty within not only geographic areas, but throughout time, through generations.
And so we've been looking at this through the lens of the student. What about, when you have a student come to your school who, in one of those situations you described, his mother's facing eviction, not mentally present, what kind of challenges does that present to the school and the community around the school as well?
Listening to you, Jeff, share about the impact of generational poverty, I'm thinking of a 6-year-old that I was working with in one of our schools. And as I share his story, there are many students in many of our schools just like this that are demanding a lot of support. Yeah. And we're talking about one child who's really creating a lot of stress in a classroom because the child is having difficulty focusing. The child won't sit. It's a 6-year-old, so when you think about developmentally what a 6-year-old should be able to do, they should be able to sit and complete their assignments. But when this is your 5th school as a 6-year-old, you've lived in multiple communities, and you've had a lot of instability and now a lot of behavioral challenges. And so that's how we're seeing their overall experience impacted, and then it creates a lot of stress for this, not only the teacher, but then the administrators. And the work that they need to do to support the child. And then if I can also share with that particular child, thinking about our administrators went to the home to see how could they help. And the first thing they noticed when mom opened the door, there was absolutely no furniture in the home. And mom shared just again some of her struggles and how she wants to help. She wants to do better by her child, but he's had a lot of trauma in his life, and he needs help. And he's only 6 years old. We can help him.
Yeah.
As we progress this conversation into some of the solutions and initiatives that we're working towards, Dr. Franco, I want to ask you again, kind of going into the college experience now. And I think something, when we're sent off to college or we go off to college, sometimes there's that, here's some ramen noodles and some bottled water, and it's that image of the starving college student. And while there's some truth to that in like, okay, you've got to pay your dues. There's also a harsher reality that, okay, yes, I'm going to be eating top ramen for a couple of years, but there is a harsher truth, as I mentioned, to some of these struggling issues when it comes to college students. And you guys are doing some incredible work to create initiatives, create solutions. What are some of those solutions and initiatives that you guys have been working on to address some of the issues for college students?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is that kind of misnomer, right, about kind of the culture of the college student, right? But I think, for the very first time a couple years ago, we had administered a survey on campus, and it went across to all students. And that was actually our very first attempt at collecting data that helped us really come to understand how pervasive food insecurity and housing insecurity were being experienced by our very own college students. And what we found was that 3 out of 10 undergraduate students experience food insecurity. So this is not like passing up one meal here and there or like having ramen every now and then.
Yeah, this is legitimate food insecurity.
This is absolutely having the constant worry and struggle about thinking, where is my next meal going to come from, right? And so writing a paper, taking a test, thinking about aspirations for pursuing graduate school, that can be very difficult if you're having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. At the University of Arizona, we have a campus pantry, and many colleges and universities have established things like this that allow students to come in and get key staple items, really to kind of maybe perhaps stretch their budgets, stretch their existing resources within their households. And last year alone, our campus pantry saw 3,607 unique users. And so we constantly see that the use of the campus pantry grow exponentially. And that was a resource that was made available and got held up even during the pandemic. So even while many folks weren't on campus, the campus pantry was open and servicing, students and other members of our campus community. So it's a real issue.
And as we start talking about solutions, Jeff, and we start having conversations to different audiences here, and we're talking about poverty being so multi-layered, we can go where in one instance it's a family living paycheck to paycheck, and another it's a family with no furniture. And how do you have the different conversations for those different levels?
Yeah, so it's what we've taken into account is that we need to really have a better vocabulary around poverty, right? So we right now as a nation use the federal poverty level as an indicator for poverty, right? And this is a federal level of income that determines your eligibility to a federal program or a benefit. Now, that level changes every single year depending on how many people are within your family. In 2023, that level was set at $30,000 a year for a family of 4 here in Arizona. But if you're living in deep poverty, that means that you're making half of that amount. So a family of 4 living off of $15,000 a year. Now that's deep poverty. And that's a measure that we really don't keep track of. And it's particularly alarming for schools because the way that schools track poverty is through the eligibility for free and reduced lunch program. And that's 130% of the federal poverty level. But we have no way of looking at how many of our kids are experiencing deep poverty, so we can't provide the targeted interventions that's going to help support that student and make sure that they're successful academically.
A different vocabulary for poverty. Dr. Myers, as we talk about the solutions that are being offered, University of Arizona, and we just talked about some of the challenges you've been facing in the classroom, what are some of those solutions and those initiatives you think have been working well for you?
Our teachers have gotten really good at teaching reading and writing and math and science and social studies, and right now what we're working on is really being good at teaching strong character and those skills that kids need so that they can be resilient in life, because it can be very hard. And so skills like how to prioritize, when you get home and there's all these distractions around you, but how to make sure that you're getting your homework done so you're better prepared when you get to school the next day. And even Dr. Frankel, you spoke about mental health. And so the importance of keeping yourself hopeful, making sure that you begin everything with the end in mind, knowing every day you're working hard in school so that you have the opportunities and are able to fulfill your dreams. And so it's really teaching the mindsets that our kids need so that they can be successful and strong as they overcome a lot of these barriers they're facing.
So as we kind of wrap up the conversation, Jeff, you were talking about changing the vocabulary. You were talking about the solutions at University of Arizona, the pantry. You're talking about helping kids understand and be in a better mindset when they're approaching learning. When we be clear with our calls to action, I'm going to kind of go around the room here and talk about if there is a message for community leaders, for business leaders, for parents. What would that call to action be? And Dr. Franco, I'll start with you. What would be your call to action?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the data points that informs my call to action is that we actually found that for students in college who experience a mental health crisis, they are 2 times more likely to not complete their degree. So if the goal, right, of access to higher education is degree completion so that they can be thriving, engaging contributors to our communities, we need to understand that there's a direct correlation there. And so if we're not thinking systemically about the solutions that we're advocating for and proposing, and also resourcing, right, then I think we've missed the mark and we've certainly let our community down.
Well said. All right, Dr. Myers, your call to action. Again, these are community leaders, these are business leaders, parents, anybody in that circle.
You know what I would say as I think about the amazing educators I have the privilege of working with every day, I would say as I see them jump into action when it comes to even the home without the furniture, they're right away trying to see what furniture they can find for the family or how they can get food, how they can meet every need. I would say that the fact is our schools can't do it alone.
Right.
And so that we really need to wrap around these families and our kids and work together to be able to provide the best solutions that will have long-term outcomes for our kids.
Jeff, tremendous conversation so far. So help us wrap up here with that call to action. Anything from what you've learned from the data, with what you're seeing firsthand, what's your call to action?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. Like we're always talking about us having to build a holistic front when we start talking about poverty and education because they're so closely linked, right? But as a nation, and Arizona included, as a nation, the way that we approach poverty is by making it a little bit more bearable. We treat the symptom, but we don't treat the root cause. So if a family needs a little bit of food, then we have WIC. If a family needs a little bit of cash, then we have TANF. If they need access to healthcare, we have access for Medicaid. But we're never getting to the root cause of poverty. And I think that's what we need to start thinking about. How do we really reinforce education and make sure that every single student has access to a world quality education? If we're one of the richest countries in the world and we can't provide a decent and quality education to our students, and that says a lot about the society that we're building. And we're shooting ourselves in the foot because poverty is expensive, not only to families, but to a whole society. And I would say that we need to rally around and build a holistic approach to eradicating poverty.
So well said. And again, as you know, these conversations go well beyond this stage. We want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Sepas, the Social Determinants of Education. As a reminder, we will continue building on the conversation every single month so we can bring you a deep dive around each one of the topics. Thank you, Jeff, Dr. Myers, Dr. Franco, for sharing your knowledge. All in Education would also like to thank their sponsor for helping making these conversations possible. Thank you so much to the Garcia Family Foundation. Jeff, I know you work closely with them hand in hand for the support that we're putting these conversations forward. Anything you'd like to say? Thank you to the Garcia family.
Yeah, thank you to the Garcia family for providing us this platform to really diving deep into some of these issues and actually even supporting some cross-sector collaborations that we have in the community.
Yep, it's all about the action we take from these conversations. Again, thank you so much, and we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.